It is Sunday, the 13th of May, 2018. I just had a little adjustment to do to the camera there. It was underexposing a bit. So basically it's Mother's Day 2018, and Mother's Day is a significant anniversary now in my protest against Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse and Unitarian Universalist cover-up and denial of clergy abuse and related issues, and then even some unrelated issues. On Mother's Day of 2013, two SPVM police officers, both of them female, possibly mothers in their own way, or not. I don't know if they're mothers or not, but they could be mothers. They came to the Unitarian Church of Montreal and tried to intimidate me into ending my protest by threatening me with a ticket. A really ridiculous pretext for a ticket. They were pretending that I'm blocking circulation on the sidewalk when I'm doing no such thing. And in fact, the two of them standing on the sidewalk, trying to threaten me into or intimidate me into ending my protest, were actually blocking the sidewalk more than I was, which I pointed out to them in our conversation. So if you want to see that conversation, just search SPVM Mother's Day Unitarian in YouTube or Google, and you'll find the video in question. You'll also find the blog post that describes that interaction with the SPVM on Mother's Day of 2013 on the Emerson Avenger blog, if you use Google or Bing or another search engine. It's worth checking out. It shows the kind of just ridiculous lengths that the SPVM unfortunately has gone to try and intimidate me into ending my protest. And it actually gets worse. I mean, that was sort of low-level police harassment, police intimidation. I've had worse than that, but in this particular case, these two female SPVM police officers just came across as being ridiculous. Anyhow, so the subject today is Mother's Day, and I'm thinking in terms of Unitarian Universalist mothers. And more particularly, I'm thinking in terms of Unitarian Universalist mothers who help Unitarians cover up and hide clergy abuse and other Unitarian Universalist injustices. And more specifically, I'm thinking in terms of Unitarian Universalist mothers who aid and abet Unitarian Universalist cover-up and denial of child sex abuse. Because in my mind, that's about one of the worst things that a Unitarian Universalist mother can do, is to help their religious community cover up and hide and even officially deny sexual abuse of children, or indeed non-sexual abuse of children, by Unitarian Universalist ministers and Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers and so on. So my chalk slogans today say, quite simply and clearly, Unitarian mothers cover up child abuse. I left sex out of it because essentially, I'm talking about today all forms of child abuse, so not just child sex abuse, but emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, and so on, because this can be quite damaging to children as well. And I know of cases where children have been psychologically and emotionally and physically abused by Unitarians, including female Unitarian clergy, but not in a sexual way per se. So we're talking purely psychological, emotional, or physical abuse of children, not sexual abuse in some cases. And it's quite damaging as well. So that's going to be the theme of today's Mother's Day protest. Thank you for avoiding the chalk slogan, sir. So anyhow, we'll come over here. We got one more. There basically have three slogans like this. One's up the other way. But that's what they say. Unitarian mothers cover up child abuse, and it's entirely 100% truthful statement. It doesn't say all Unitarian mothers cover up child abuse, but based on my experience and so on, I think I can say that the vast majority of Unitarian mothers who know about my protest against Unitarian child abuse in particular have at minimum engaged in complicit silence, which helps to conceal child abuse. So at minimum, they have just kept quiet about it. They have not spoken out against it, etc. But unfortunately, some Unitarian mothers, and indeed a fair number of the Unitarian Universalist mothers on the internet, who have seen my tweets, for instance, about Unitarian abuse of children, whether sexual or not, they've essentially actively helped to conceal it by, for instance, blocking me on Twitter, making my tweets to them invisible so people can't read them, and so on. Because I have tweeted to female Unitarian Universalists on Twitter, some of whom are mothers, and instead of responding in a responsible manner, they've blocked me. And in blocking me, what that does is it hides my tweets to them that would appear below their own tweets that I'm responding to on their own timeline. So it basically conceals from their Twitter followers my tweets about Unitarian child abuse and Unitarian Universalist cover-up and denial of child abuse. So they're more than just tacitly complicit via complicit silence. They are active participants in concealing Unitarian Universalist child abuse from the public. So we're going to pick up some picket signs here and start circulating. But one of the ways that Unitarians cover up child abuse is the fact that the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston hired Stikeman Elliott barristers and solicitors litigation lawyer, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe, to falsely accuse me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel in UUA legal bullying that was clearly intended to intimidate me into removing blog posts that tell the readily verifiable truth about such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by certain Unitarian Universalist ministers. If I can quote a few choice phrases from the arrogant and aggressive cease and desist demand letters that Maitre Marc-André Coulombe had me served with in June of 2012. So we're coming up to the 6th anniversary of being falsely accused of the criminal act of blasphemous libel in UUA clergy sex abuse and indeed Unitarian child sex abuse cover-up, because the blog posts in question were about the Unitarian Universalist minister known as Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, who was charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape and also the unnatural rape, I'll let you guys figure out what that means, of teenage Tibetan refugees who he had lured away from their families in India with promises of a better life in America. So Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell went to India, I think ostensibly on a humanitarian mission, and he was in contact with Tibetan refugee families in India, basically Tibetans who had fled Tibet, when China took over, and were refugees in India. And he essentially told their parents, presumably told their mothers, that, if they gave their children over to him into his care, that he would ensure, that they had a better life in America. He essentially represented to these parents, that their daughters would be, get a good education and be well taken care of, maybe even promise that he would get them, U.S. citizenship. So they gave their daughters over to his care, one in particular, who I won't name, but the first one was the one who got the brunt of things, and she was basically brought to Massachusetts by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell at a time when she was 16 years old, as I understand it, and she was repeatedly sexually exploited. I'm being polite here saying sexually exploited, basically essentially a sex slave of Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell for a time period measured in years. According to the news reports that I've read, the first one, or at least the first one that we know of in terms of Mac Mitchell being convicted of rape and so on, she essentially escaped the clutches of Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, I believe, when she was in her early 20s. So basically, she was repeatedly raped by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell for a period of at least 4 years, maybe 5 or 6 years. But there were others who came later, as I understand it, and there might have been some who came before. But nonetheless, this is Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, repeatedly raping teenage Tibetan refugees. And I will say that, like I said, it's not all Unitarian mothers who cover up child abuse. And in fact, it was Unitarian mothers, at least Unitarian Universalist women, who actually reported Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell's crimes to the police. So what happened is Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell's victim, after escaping his clutches, I believe literally running away from home, as it were, at some point soon afterwards, told some of the leading church members of Mac Mitchell's congregations, because he was actually ministered to 2 congregations in Massachusetts, Westboro and Northborough. And essentially what happened is his victim, the one who ran away, told about what was going on to female board members of one of his congregations. And the upshot is that these female board members thought that the best thing to do was to report the allegations to the police and let the police handle it, which they did. So these particular Unitarian Universalist mothers did not, in fact, cover up child abuse. They did, in fact, do the right thing by reporting the alleged rapes to the police. And Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell was subsequently charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape and indeed the unnatural rape of at least 1 and I think 2 of his victims. There could well have been more victims, but in terms of the court case, I believe there was the absolute minimum 1 obviously victim, but I think there was at least 1 other victim involved. So anyway, so these particular mothers did the right thing, but other mothers did the exact opposite. Other members of the congregation, indeed I would say probably a majority of the members of the congregation, shunned and ostracized these women who had actually done the right thing by reporting the rapes to the police. These female board members of one of the churches, I believe it was the Westboro Church, but I could be mistaken. It might have been the Northboro one. I just don't have the information right at my fingertips, but it's in newspaper reports. Unfortunately, most of those newspaper reports are not available online. You have to go to newspaper databases that you can only access. Well, actually, they are accessible online, but not on the normal internet, to the best of my knowledge. You basically have to go to university libraries to access these newspaper databases. But in any case, what I'm getting at is you know, this small handful of Unitarian Universalist women, some of whom probably were mothers, did the right thing, but other Unitarian Universalist mothers did the wrong thing by ostracizing and shunning and otherwise bullying and intimidating these women for essentially doing the right thing. And this happens a lot, actually. It's quite common that when clergy sexual misconduct of any kind is reported, that you know, many members of the congregation of the minister, to say nothing of the Unitarian Universalist Association itself, instead of dealing responsibly with the clergy sexual misconduct in question, basically pretty much whitewash the minister and go after the complainants, and otherwise try to conceal what happened. It was a common practice, and may still be a common practice for the Unitarian Universalist Association to demand that the complainants must sign confidentiality agreements before the Unitarian Universalist Association acts on their complaint. Actually, you know, thinking about it, it's probably no longer a practice of the Unitarian Universalist Association, but certainly there was a time, a fairly long period of time, when that's what happened, when there was a complaint about clergy sexual misconduct of any kind brought against a Unitarian Universalist minister with the UUA. The UUA insisted that the complainants must sign confidentiality agreements before they would even start handling the clergy misconduct complaint. So they were able to essentially sign